Welcome back to the Pilgrim Faith Podcast, where human wonder fuels the quest for Christian wisdom. I'm joined again today by my good friend Dale Stenberg, my faithful co-host. And one of the things that we often talk about in our private conversations is the nature of being a layperson in the modern church. I've been teaching a course for the Davenant Hall on the philosophy of modernity. Basically, what are the interpretations out there, mostly from kind of sociologists and philosophers, on the nature of just what constitutes the modern world. And one of the claims that we exegeted as we went throughout that course, which we just finished, was that one could call modernity the sort of simultaneous global renegotiation of all human custom. So where you see the kind of tendrils of modernity arise, you see the renegotiation of nations, you see the renegotiation of the relationship between employer and employee, subject and authority, man and wife, layperson and pastor, all authority structures, all custom doesn't go away, but the way in which custom mediates how that has typically been received does get renegotiated in a modern context, even if the old way and the old habits are reaffirmed and chosen. And that's a crucial thing to say. But one of the things that we can elicit from all that that's interesting, I think, is to talk about what does it mean to be a layperson. Respecting one's elders in a modern context, in a modern church with modern habits and modern concerns. What is the we could call it the responsibility, but what's also the role of the layperson in the church? And I think that's a worthy conversation and one that I think is particularly relevant for the time we're in right now.
Yeah, I remember we were talking with Ryan Hurd, one of the teaching fellows at the Davenant Institute, who's doing, in my opinion, the best work on recovering divine simplicity and working with Aquinas and primary sources. And in that conversation, I believe we talked about the office of doctor in the church. Which was a category of a learned scholar that was an authority on doctrine and how to sort of navigate the hairy passages in the Bible that just seemed foreign to most lay people. Now we don't have that anymore. And I think one of the reasons is the proliferation of theological education in general and the individual specialization, the specialized education of young men that are interested in digging deeper into theology. But what that has done is sort of create an environment in the local assembly of saints in which the leadership, however that manifests in your denomination, may not necessarily be the most well-educated persons in that congregation.
Yeah.
And this really is unique to the modern age. So I think what we are wanting to talk about is how does that look on the ground, and how do we think about those relationships between the laity and the officers?
Yeah.
Well, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say even though you and I would very much affirm a kind of classical Reformed ethos about the authority that ministers play in the community, nevertheless, I think to modern ears, you can go and read kind of rhetoric about the minister in the past that seems a little shocking, even to modern people with modern sentiments who very much believe in respecting the minister. There's still, nevertheless, a little bit of like, oh wow, that's when the minister opens his mouth, you're the Puritans speak like this a lot. Yes. Part of that, I would imagine, does come from contexts where, as you were just alluding to, it comes from contexts where it's ordinary that the minister really is the most educated person in the community, and knows the scriptures much, much, much better than almost everybody in the community, and tends to be a well-rounded, complicated individual in these societies, I think, in a lot of cases. you add all of that together, and it's not surprising that that becomes the rhetorical emphasis. Listen to the one who knows things, effectively the one whom God has set aside to know these things. Right. And what complicates that in the modern context, not the duty, and not that relationship doesn't fully change, but a sort of layer is added to that authority and submission space, if we could put it that way. When you do have a congregation where there might be a half dozen people in the congregation, this isn't that common, but it's not hard to find a church where there's a half dozen people in the congregation who know more than the pastor, or know the scriptures in certain ways more than the pastor. And what do you do with that? And I think there's, you've seen very bad and very good models of what that actually winds up looking like in the church. And maybe I can.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And I was going to say something similar, and that's, so I think that here's, so if we just recognize that this is a phenomenon of modernity, right, and we just sort of recognize it and say, yep, that's a thing, then what do we do? Because I think what the impulse of some may be is to assume that they're the one in the congregation that's smarter than the old guy that's been doing ministry for 40 years preaching.
Right.
And so their ears might perk up, and they might say, oh, they're talking about me. And that may be true, but it may not be true. And I think that if we're just labeling that and saying, this is a thing, how do we deal with it? The first move is to say, okay, first I need to be very humble,
right,
in the way that I'm evaluating my theological sort of cred. And how much do I really understand about my minister's theological cred?
Right.
Because ministers have to move in and out of a whole host of different sort of personalities and educational levels of their congregants that are dealing with marital problems and yada, yada, yada. You just list off the litany of things that a pastor has to do. And that, I think, creates inside of the pastor a better listening. A good pastor becomes a better listener. And so they economize their words to sort of aim at the thing that this particular person needs, and then pull the trigger when they can, in order to help this person grow.
Right.
And that minister might be doing that to you. He might be on a recon mission with you to determine what you're actually all about. And if you're just sort of like, regurgitating the latest book, the thesis of the latest book that you read to sort of show the pastor, I've got this skills, I understand this little.
Right.
But in 10 years, that little thing that you thought was so profound might just be the normal thing that all pastors, for the most part, understand. So it really is doing a self-evaluative sort of analysis on really where you're at in your theological development, and then being humble when you think that you're going to be the guy that has answers for people in the church. So that would be like, I think, the first move. And then if it's determined that, yes, it seems pretty clear to me after some time here, listening to the teaching, having conversations, getting to know the people, because the people really are sort of a reflection of the ministers, and the ministers really are a reflection of the people, actually. You can get a good understanding of sort of where you're at in the dynamic and what your gifts are and who you can give those gifts away to. And that might be that your gifts are intended to be given to the minister to aid him in his calling as a minister. And if that seems to be the case, then how do we sort of settle into that particular dynamic in a wise way? I think that's really at the heart of what we're talking about.
Yeah, I think one of the difficult, one of the struggles, and I should back up and just clarify. I think it's still probably the case that there are just plenty of churches. I know plenty of churches where certainly the minister or one of the elders, in fact, that's probably still ordinary, is the most, sort of sort of educated person in the church on these sorts of issues. There's just plenty of exceptions. That's really what we're talking about here. Is in the modern church, there's just more exceptions to this, and that's what's contextualizing this conversation. I think the first thing you said is just right, which is, there's so many people that like they start to learn theology, especially young men, and maybe this is sort of like the 90s internet era, right. But I think I still see it going on Facebook as well. It's not uncommon, especially in the Reformed community, for kind of young men to get really excited and to grow enormously in an enormous amount of theological knowledge. And then you get that kind of same story where, you're looking around for a church, you go to church, and you're just kind of throwing theological swagger around. Yeah. You're showing everybody what's up. You're kind of being a little annoying and sitting back in Sunday school and being all cool or whatever. And the vibe you're sending out is, hey, I know a lot, pay attention to me. And it's a bad look. It's immature. And generally speaking, you're going to wind up being a stumbling block to pastors and elders. Yes. Because you're tempting them to be annoyed at you. Yes. When there's no reason to. And I think what you said is right. Go in humble, go in assuming not just that the pastors and elders have something to teach you, but that the people around you in those pews have something to teach you. And go in assuming that if these are your elders and that is your pastor, and I think this is crucial for people, especially people with theological education. You can get the impression like, like I know all this stuff, I've read this, that, and the other. What can the pastor tell me? Yeah. And it's like, what you just said is right. He's had 40 years of ministry probably, and he's not reducible to, whatever collection of propositions you think. He's a person whom God has called to this. And I think that each person ought to have a posture toward their elders and toward their ministers, and really toward other people in their church. That if somebody is in my face, opening a mouth and speaking to me, maybe in God's providence, that's the thing I need, and he sent them in my life, even if their motivations are mixed. Nevertheless, he sent them in my life to speak words to me, and I need to be humble and receive that. And then on the backside of that, it's really from that spirit, I think, then that you just because you are gifted at what you're gifted at, you're open about your gifts, and you posture them as things that are there to serve in whatever way the leadership of the pastors and elders feel like it needs to be used. And so you're not kind of coming in itching to showing the signal that I'm itching to like find a position. You're going in giving the signal, hey, I'm actually not here to go find my influence. I'm here to serve. If you want that, good. If you don't, all right. And you let the Lord mostly work that out.
Yeah. And you and I have talked about this a lot, but I think it's worth repeating because I do think it is one of those things in the modern age, given the amount of information, given the publication of books that we've not had access to, and the types of personalities that are attracted to those theological treatises or philosophy or sociology or politics or you name it, right? Pick your thing. We do have a greater access to all of these materials. And we have teachers. Formally in like seminaries or university or college or whatever. We have teachers inside of the church. So it's if the first move is to sort of be humble, recognize your gifts, accumulate the information, and then give that information, and it's not just information. I want to be careful here because that relates to what I'm about to say. But if you really do find that your calling is to be that guy that's going to be entrenched for the most part in intentional, rigorous, disciplined study of all the things, then you really should see yourself in a humble way as giving something to your minister. Wisdom, I think, in part, is recognizing how you go about doing that. So we're talking about the annoying guy in the back of the Sunday school that's like, burr, 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 did you hear that Bavinck said Hirsch? You know, you make all the moves and then everybody's like, oh, he's read, so he know. Instead of being that guy, right, you could be the guy that quietly sort of hums underneath the radar, that sort of throws out the gift as it presents itself and say that I can contribute to this thing in a constructive way that doesn't make me look annoying. And I'm going to rely on people responding to me, including my minister, on a personal one-on-one level. So it really goes from, are you wanting to be a showman, or are you really wanting to do the hard work of being a godly man serving your church in spirit and truth?
And just giving the gifts away that you have to give in the organic way that you give that, and sending the signals there again that like you're part of the team and you're there to support that team. And it's, you know, these things are complicated, you know, in that, you know, again, as we think about this as this is an era where lay people are experiencing a particular sort of ethos as a layperson within evangelical congregations. But there's also sort of an adjustment for elders and ministers to experience on their side. What does it mean to be an elder and minister?
That's what I literally just wrote down.
You know, so for instance, like, you know, elders, you know, to use that Timothy language, are sort of fathers of the church. That's sort of the household of Christ. You know, they really are kind of the fathers of the community. But the model for the most part is that the relationship that a father has to an adult child. So most of the people in the church are not, you know, you and your 5-year-old. Most of the people at the church are you the 70-year-old with your 40-year-old kid, where the dynamic is not just telling people what to do, right? You know, it's the assumption is that you have an adult relationship to this project in a sense at the get-go. But in any case, when you have this, when you enter these social circumstances, these church circumstances, one of the virtues on the other side, one of the virtues I think that elders and pastors have, and you know, I think we've both seen plenty of different reactions here, is what is the kind of automatic reaction to another gifted person near them. And you definitely can. There's definitely congregations out there. Like let's just call a spade a spade. This is a real thing. There definitely are places where if you know the knowledgeable guy comes in, and even if he's not sort of like throwing it out there for advertisement, just the presence of the knowledgeable guy is intimidating or related to in a kind of insecure way. You're kind of nervous. Is this person going to lead people away? That sort of thing. Whereas really secure pastors and elders, and this has been I've seen this as well, and it's really a remarkable and wonderful thing when you see it. When you see people who are secure that I'm a pastor because God called me to be a pastor, and we're elders because God called us to be elders, and we're just confident that God is working through us with this community, they're just happy when the gifted people come. And you know, their attitude is God brought the gifts here. Great. And there's this automatic, the church I go to now, certainly that's been my experience, was there was, again, I didn't come in sort of swinging around saying, look what I can do. Right. But nevertheless, to the extent that it was known, it was always seen as an, oh, good, that's exactly what, that'll be really great around here.
Yes.
You know, and so there was never this nervousness about it.
And I think that this gets into like really, and I know this word has been abused, but I'm just going to use it because whatever. But like the missional mindset, if you really are, and really this gets to the Catholicity, the idea of Catholicity, because if you think that your church is the only sort of orthodox church standing against the tide of the progressive waves that's washing away the Christian tradition in the modern age, then you're going to have a posture to authority, to people that come into your church that's largely suspicious. But if you have the mentality like God is growing his church in North America right now, because that's just where we are,
right?
God is growing his church through people coming to faith in Christ and being discipled in local congregations sprinkled throughout the country. And I'm keeping my eye open for the people that God sends me, that I have the opportunity to help sharpen and make razor sharp, hone all their skills in, so that they're an effective tool against Satan. If that's sort of the posture, then I think that breeds a healthy environment for people that are humbly wanting to be discipled, but they also recognize their gifts and they want to give those gifts away. That will attract those sorts of people, and they can feel comfortable in their own skin in something like that, where they don't look at it as like, well, I need to make sure to make this move, because if I make this move, then things could go bad. If I make this move, they're not looking for the pitfalls all over the place. They just walk into a congregation, the pastor receives them, the pastor's happy that he has this new little weapon, not to instrumentalize people, but to say, like, this is what God just sent me. Thank you, God. Let me do everything I can to help this man advance the cause of Jesus Christ. Because at the end of the day, the church is Jesus's church. And it's not Pastor X, Y, and Z's church. It's Christ's church. And we should be good stewards with the people that Jesus brings into his fold. So we're sort of looking at this from two angles. We're looking at it from the congregant side, and then we're looking at it from the side of ministers. Yeah. And we're touching on both of those things. I want to ask you, just because I'm curious, why do you think that, well, let me ask you this first. Do you think that there's a third sort of thing going on? Because I don't want to just pigeonhole people. You're either in this sort of church or you're in this sort of church. And it could be that the educated fellow that's got a bunch of gifts that God has given him doesn't just waltz into the church, but he grows up from a baby, right, inside of that church.
Yes.
So is there a third sort of category that we could sort of put our finger on and go, well, actually, this is a way that could look also, that's not necessarily ministers that are threatened by the intelligent guy and ministers that just sort of embrace them fully. There's got to be like a spectrum of responses.
I think in a sense, at least for me, what I've been talking about the whole time would be a third category by that standard. Because I think it would be nerve-wracking, certainly, to sort of, it would be rare, of course, as well, but it would, to sort of embrace somebody that you don't know. Like, ministers have an interest in the doctrinal and moral purity of the congregation. There is if you're a guy that looks like you could be I hate to use this word, but a quote quote influencer in the church, and you move into the congregation and you start attending there, it's actually important for them, if they think like, okay, this could be one of those personalities, not to be skeptical or cynical, but to get a read. That's just going to be an important thing for a wise minister, just to know who's in their midst and to know who might, because there are, wolves do come in. And so it's not wrong to have an eyeball on that. People can be cynical about it and insecure over it. That's where I think sin can be operative. But to be prudent and wise about it, I think is absolutely crucial. And that's where the distinction you made really matters. So, the guy who's been raised in the congregation and winds up becoming, and I've seen that several times, they're raised in the congregation, they grow up to be a minister, and they wind up becoming a leader in the church. That's a way to cultivate and pass on real trust for a very delicate position. And that's exactly why when you come in from the outside, I think, people don't know you walk to the new congregation. That's why when you come into the outside, the vibes you're sending out are very crucial, because it's, and again, I don't mean this might sound like as though the point is like, you want to take over the world, fellas, make sure you don't do it on the day one. You got to wait till day 3. That's not the point. The point is rather, you actually do, like if you're gifted and you're supposed to give those gifts to the church, go do that. But the way to do that, and what you need to do that is through the discipline and gift of being on the team of the leaders God has given you. And that can be frustrating. That can be limiting. There's a whole set of things to be said there. And I think it might even be worth talking about that for just a second, because I know here at Davenant, we've had a lot of publication and a lot of discussion in various avenues with Jonathan Lehman of 9 Marks and such about church authority.
Yes.
And I think it's worth saying on that, most of the conversations I think we've had theologically at Davenant, and for listeners who don't know what I'm talking about, that's fine. There's been conversations between Davenant or representatives of Davenant and representatives of other traditions on the precise nature of church authority. And one thing Davenant has insisted upon over its years in various writings and in public conversations and such. The insistence has been that, we don't just say that the word of the church or the word of the elders or the word of the minister is automatically the word of God. That's nobody's saying that. That's just not even Protestant, right? When the pastor speaks, even from the pulpit, and when the pastor speaks, behind the scenes, the authority of the word, whether or not divine moral authority is intrinsically there, has to do with whether or not what they're saying is true or not. Nevertheless, one thing we've always still insisted upon, and I think this is still crucial, whether pastors are right or wrong, or elders are right or wrong, or let's use that differently. Let's say it this way: whether they're perfect or imperfect, and they're all imperfect, they do have a political authority, just like the father has a political authority in the home, whatever their decisions are. And when you are joining yourself to that household, just as if you were to join yourself to the household of a man, the only way to do that and for it to be a healthy place with a healthy dynamic is to join yourself to a team who you have agreed to have a submissive and humble spirit toward. Sure. And I think that means treating them as the extra layer to add there again is that providential layer. Be expectant, even if you could read them cynically, even if you could read uncharitably, be expectant that God, when somebody is speaking to you who's in a spiritual authority over you, might really be speaking words that you need to hear, which doesn't mean, there's cases of spiritual abuse and there's cases of people being unjust. There's plenty of them, in fact. And so none of this is to say, don't have a brain and let yourself get abused. None of that's true. Yeah. But that's not our only problem. Our problem is also that we just don't want to listen.
Yes.
That we don't believe, somebody has something to tell us. And sometimes people do have something to tell us. And
I think that
people do. We need to be told what first sometimes.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. And I think this really is not even a problem that's particular to the church. Obviously, you mentioned the family, and I would just say that the same principle that you just articulated of, you got to be on the team. You got to walk into the house and go, okay, I'm here. I'm going to join the house. I'm going to be on the team. That goes to the civil sphere as well. It works in the home, it works in the church, and it works in a nation or a state or a city or a community or an HOA or whatever.
Yeah, one of the great ironies of conservatives, actually, no, I shouldn't say all conservatives, but I'm sure you've detected this. There's this fascinating irony that you have so often like such disrespect toward the civic sphere and even kind of troublesomeness at church. But then in the home, there's this expectancy of like dictatorial subservience.
Yeah. That's what I was going to, that's what I'm driving at, is that this is a phenomena in the modern age, I think, because trust systems are broken. Once the trust breaks down in whatever community you find yourself in, then the people that are in leadership roles, they get the biggest dose of mistrust directed right at them.
Yeah.
So you can blame all your problems on them, which just further sort of divides, because sometimes, and this really is this, because I wanted to touch on abuse. You mentioned abuse, and that is extremely important to say. Just to say, abuse happens in churches all the time. Yes. And if anything, we're watching it. I mean, there's a story out every month. It feels
every 15 seconds. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. It's just unbelievable. Right. So you don't want to be that sort of mindless lemming that has a view of authority that believes that authority is supposed to dictate everything that you believe, everything you feel, everything you think, and everything you do. That's not why we go to church. That's not what elders are for. That's not what we look to our fathers, our human fathers, for. That's not what we look to our magistrates for. But there is implied in that natural sort of hierarchy, for lack of a better term, and I know you would make distinctions on what exactly we're talking about, but but just to say there needs to be an implicit trust from the beginning. If you voluntarily, and in the case of the home, involuntarily, join yourself to this community of people, that those are the guys over there that have
being a little bit Baptist there, aren't you, Dale?
Yes, I am. This is where my Baptist will come out, because of course. And it doesn't matter. Like if you end up in a church and there are elders or bishops, or call them whatever you want, there are authorities in the church.
Yes.
There's an implicit trust that they're automatically given. Not a blind trust, but an implicit trust,
a good faith.
Of good faith, and a subscription to being underneath of them as a subject. Yes. You are placing yourself underneath of their rule, and it's not just Baptist churches. I was going to say Baptist churches suffer, I think, from this a little bit more than Presbyterian models of government, because they're isolated, independent churches. So some Baptist churches, and none of the churches none of the Baptist churches I've had good relationships with operate like this. But sometimes you find a Baptist church where the main pastor is sort of like the CEO. And his wife is sort of like the CFO. Yeah. Yes. And then everybody else is just sort of cubicle workers that they're trying to get to go do all the things that they want them to do.
The staff. And that's not the same thing as the session. Totally different. Yes.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. But I've also been in the last church I was in was a church that was dedicated to total transparency. And it was more of a democratic thing. So the authority, and I don't want to get into ecclesiology inside baseball or whatever, but the authority really, like this, does come from the whole church, not just one guy at the top.
Right. Well, that's part of what that's part of really why Baptists historically have had, to some extent, perhaps a richer, precisely because of their ecclesiology. And I don't think there's anything that Presbyterians and Anglicans can't get from this, because actually this is true of Anglicans as well, Baptists coming out of the Church of England, right? Have had a rich theology of the laity. I think, for instance, in the Baptist confession, there's a category for the gifted brethren, for instance, and I'm not even sure that exists in the Westminster variant of that particular piece of ecclesiology. Nevertheless, in the real world and on the ground, it seems like such a practical category, and one that's fairly, I shouldn't say prominent, but one seemingly implied in the New Testament. And so, I think all the things you're saying are correct about abuse and about the structures that can make that more prevalent. And it's a tricky thing, just like respecting, like you say, like respecting the civil magistrate and respecting one's husband in a home. Husbands can be dictatorial. Husbands sin. And husbands need to be opposed sometimes. Yes. And civil government needs to be opposed. Not against the team, but a particular decision needs to be protested or something like this. And in a good church, there's a healthy dynamic at play where those frustrations can be voiced and sort of come out and worked through in a healthy way. Maybe one other thing worth emphasizing in our conversation is the role. We've talked about the role that maybe people gifted in way X, because right now we're just talking about like, the intellectually or kind of culturally gifted or whatever maybe have role X to play in encouraging their minister or whatever in this way. But everybody has that role of encouraging their minister through in elders and one another through their own gifts. But it is worth mentioning. I think the thing you said earlier is really crucial. Lay people, and I've heard this said before scandalously, I think lay people, especially those without a great deal of emotional intelligence, can kind of look at what a pastor does. And I've actually heard people sort of say, like, what do they do all day? Blah, 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 blah. Right, sort of like, I'm out here doing my 60 hours of work. And what are they doing? Like going around and getting coffee and lunch with people or whatever. Right, and the idea is like they don't work hard or something like that. First of all, you and I know the average minister we've known works obscenely
ridiculous,
obscenely hard. And that does not even state the degree of psychological and emotional burden you have when you know everybody's problems, when you're working through all of the things, all of the time, when things are awkward because people, relate to you weirdly, precisely because you're the minister. Yes. There's family stresses that come from that. You go down, and some of this is dynamics in kind of church life and ecclesiastical life that come from expectations of the minister relative to the congregation that are unhealthy. So for instance, I suspect a lot of problems, I'll get back to the main point in a second, but just a parenthetical comment. I suspect a lot of problems come from models where pastors always kind of come in as a flank move from other congregations, and they come into situations where they don't know the elders real well. And you wind up seeing these circumstances where like elders and pastors don't get along very well. You've just seen that over and over and over again. And so one of the things that happens, I think, that creates some of the dynamics we're talking about, say take an instance like, and again, this is parenthetical, but something like pastoral isolation, at least from the cheap seat, sometimes it looks like isolation is almost engineered into the thing when the pastor arrives. Both because the congregation has a sort of like, that's the pastor's family sort of aura around the pastor, and because the pastor's family can receive that aura. And once they realize, in the congregation, like, oh, actually, I guess I'm really not on board with these elders, they wind up that there's just a whole kind of social gap between pastor and congregation that I think I've seen work against a lot of ministerial lives. But all of that to say, even if those dynamics aren't present intentionally, even if they're absent, in fact, all of the things you just mentioned still obtain, which is the level of emotional burden, the level of investment psychologically in the intimacy of people's lives. And this is true of elders as well. When you have elders who practice, as in my church, elders who are good and practice visitation, it takes a lot. And I think we underestimate, just as sometimes in a home, I heard somebody say this once, and I think it was wonderful. We can underestimate in a home how long a man can go without encouragement. Yeah. He can be faithful, kind of the loyal puppy dog, but you don't realize that he's kind of running on encouragement fumes. And I do suspect there's a lot of cases where pastors are just giving and giving and giving and giving and giving. And thinking and studying and preparing and trying not to offend that person and needing to offend that person. And every day over and over, and they have their own problems and their own sins and their own pains and their own whatever. And they subsist on that kind of mouse wheel. Yeah. With very little encouragement. And yes. So one of the things I would want to say as lay people, maybe as we're kind of moving toward a conclusion to our conversation here, is I think it's really crucial in the modern church for lay people to take up their dominion in the church precisely through a deeper encouragement of their leaders. If your pastor preached a good sermon, no, and you don't need to tell them every week, but make a point, Yeah. If your pastor preaches a good sermon, to speak appreciation into their lives, or just to the pastor's family's life, all of those things, and into your elders. Tell them how much you appreciate it when they eld well.
Right. Yeah, and I've tried to make a habit out of that, Joe. I remember, so years ago, we had a new pastor come into a church that Rachel and I were in the process of joining. We'd only been there like 4, 5, 6 months or something like that. And the new guy showed up. And it was a small church at the time. It's grown exponentially now. But I remember I was right in the middle of like reading Bonson and Van Til, and I'm dabbling in Calvin a little bit. But I had moved on from like the Desiring God, Ligonier stuff. And I'm like starting to get into what I thought at the time was like the big boys stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. You were being theology red-pilled.
Yes, it's just the red pill all over the place. Growing pains, just all the things are just exploding out of me everywhere.
Yes. Can we still stone adulterers? Yeah, that's right. That becomes the smart question to ask in the locker room. Yeah.
Yes. But he came and we started to have dinner with him fairly often. What I quickly came to realize is that the life of a pastor, as you just got done so eloquently sort of laying out, the psychological, emotional, spiritual toll that it takes to be able to effectively, because if you go into that position of authority where you have to answer for the souls underneath your care, that's a huge charge.
Yeah.
And that could cause, I imagine, like existential dread at like 2:30 in the morning because you can't sleep. The burden, the weight, it's heavy as the crown sort of thing. But I tried to be very intentional about encouraging pastors. And you told me something one time that has stuck with me, and now I tell other men this.
Yeah.
I think one time you said you take the sort of honor your elders or whatever, honor your pastors, honor your leaders. To mean just don't be a jerk that sort of drags them down and you're always the guy that they have to worry about all the time and they're constantly dumping time and energy into you. Be an encouragement to them. Like honoring them is not making unnecessary drama or work for them and encouraging them along the way. And I don't care where you are in your set of gifts or how intellectual you are or how fine-grained your theological, technical training goes. Everyone can do that.
Yeah.
Everyone can do that and everyone should do that.
Yeah. You'll be surprised and really, it's funny we're saying this, it's like the simplest way that we could say any of this is just like obey God in all of these areas, because the things we're talking about are just things we're told to do. Hebrews, talks about these people watching out for your souls, the implication being like, hey, this is a hard job. So don't be in, exactly. Don't be a problem for these poor people who have these, who I shouldn't say poor, who we can also say, and I think a lot of them would say they get to do this. It's a privilege to do it. It's nevertheless a labor to do it. And we're supposed to support that labor. And it's, as in anything in any authority and submission context, there's tricks to that. It can be difficult. And I think the principles analogize in the home, they analogize here, they analogize in our relationship to the civil magistrate. And really what we're doing, I think, in having a conversation like this is talking about what it means to have a godly relationship to authority, really.
Yeah.
In general, in an era where that's not natural to us, and where most authority relationships do assume a greater degree of adultness in the subjects than has historically been ordinary. And that is actually true even in the relationship between man and wife. You get that kind of, it's offensive now, and I think rightly so, to kind of have that sort of 1950s, like, the women, they get too much information and then their head gets crazy. It's like, it's not exactly how they can actually think and read books and stuff, who would have thunk, and so, they're not that kind of infantilizing thing. But once you get beyond that model, respect and deference, also having that moment where you can say, like, actually, you know, elder or pastor, I think this thing, what about that? That's a complicated thing that takes wisdom and humility, and we all need that. And I think if we're, you know, our job as lay people, and that's what our conversation is about, because neither you and I are ministers, neither you and I are elders. But what we are is people who give gifts as lay people to the congregations we're in, and have opportunities to nevertheless encourage and nevertheless be that person who's a joy to pastor.
Yeah.
You know, because, hey, I'm here to give you my gifts and help out, and I'm also not here to annoy you. And you also earn the moment, perhaps, to kind of say the thing if it's like, well, actually, I have a strong opinion about this thing, and you're ultimately the leader here, but like, I'm gonna tell you that thing, and you earn the right to, you know, you earn the right to have that say. I think when you've put out that good vibe, when you've not been a stumbling block, and really that's what we're talking about here, is like, how do you both encourage your leaders, and how do you not be a stumbling block to them? And it's kind of, you know, we can't speak for them. It's up to them to figure out the other side. And I think in both of our cases, we've had great experiences with pastors and elders who've ministered to us very deeply.
And just to drive that point home, and this is just from my personal experience, but you do earn the right to sort of have your voice heard. If something's bothering you and it's serious enough and it's worthy of attention and you draw attention to it, they will have a respect for you as a man, as a godly man given a set of gifts, and they will receive your wisdom if they are also godly men that understand what's going on. But what I've noticed is, and then we'll close after this, I'll let you have the last word, I'll wrap us up, but is that they'll seek you out too. So if you come into a congregation and you have this relationship with your ministers and your elders, then they will inevitably start to ask your advice on things. That was my experience. It's like we're putting a conference on. What do you think we should do? What do you think about this? Like, I'm thinking about doing a sermon series on this. What do you think about that? Do you think it's wise? Are there things in the church that you think this would address? So you really do join the council, so to speak. Maybe not formally, but informally, they notice that this is a man who God has equipped with a certain level of wisdom and insight and learning. And let me draw from that well to see what I can get out of it in order to benefit my ministry to the rest of the people. And in that way, you are ministering to the people via the leadership as they seek your advice, and you give good, wise, humble, sober advice. So, I guess that's all I wanted to add to what you said there.
I think that's correct. And I think, and what, like you said, that's going to depend upon the humility and the godliness of ministers. And again, you know, we could make this qualification all day long, but you and I are deeply aware that there's people out there, and perhaps listeners, who've had experiences with you know, church leaders where there was reasonable things to say that weren't listened to. That's not an uncommon experience. But I think one thing worth saying that this sort of adds to what you said. It was a piece of advice I remember somebody giving me in a previous church of mine, my friend John. He said, Joe, we were up for elder election season, and I thought this was interesting. He said, Joe, do you want to know who you should make an elder, or who you should nominate to be an elder? Find the person who's already doing the work of the elder and then nominate them to be the elder. Same thing. And what that does is get rid of the guy who just wants the position, right? And somebody who already has the gift. And what we're identifying there, and I think you have in your Baptist confession, gifted brethren, right? The gifts and the offices are different. The reason what you said just works well, and kind of inevitably happens, is because the gift you have is a gift that you that you kind of share to some extent. There's an overlapping gift between you and the minister, and he's drawing upon your gift for the sake of his office, which you do not possess. And I think that's a really crucial distinction, because there's what that adage implies. Even though there's plenty of people gifted in the ways we're talking about who are not qualified to be the elder, all it does, nevertheless, is help us make the distinction between gift and office. And really, this whole conversation implies, I think, that distinction, which is God has given his church the gifts of people with all sorts of gifts: theological, understanding, insight, wisdom, encouragement, serving, all those things. And then there are offices which organize those gifts on behalf of the whole congregation. And if you what that implies is exactly what you said. Yeah, you should be expectant that you walk into a congregation and there's many people in the congregation gifted at teaching, and the congregation ideally is drawing upon all of those gifts and then sort of channeling their public face through the guidance and the leadership of the pastors and elders. That's filter is maybe the wrong, it's the perfection, it's the flowering, it's the gardening of those gifts into a public face is perhaps the better way to put that. So I think I'll end there. I'll with the last note to, I think, lay people. If you're a lay person in a congregation, I really do think we need to think about this very seriously in the world. We might have inherited a sort of model of the minister that's sort of an aura, a kind of sacred object over there that is liable in a modern context actually to leave you in a great deal of frustration. And rather, it's good to, I think, look at your leadership as the leaders God has given you, the gifts God has given you, to have an attitude of deference toward them, but also to be confident that God has given you gifts and put you in this congregation to serve, and be open to use them and serve them, and don't feel that weird dynamic, and actually have that helpful, both kind of offering your gifts, but also deferential toward your leaders dynamic that is that I think is part of figuring out how to do this well.
Yeah. Well, this was a good conversation. I'm glad we had it. And I'm sure we'll probably reference back to this at points in other areas, because I think you and I both try to talk about all the things and everything, and that's a beautiful thing. So good conversation. Thank you, brother. As always, you guys can head over to davenetinstitute.org to check out what Davenet's doing. We've got new classes for Davenet Hall that are coming up. Everyone should check those out. You can find all of our previous episodes on iTunes or any podcast catcher, but you can also head over to Davenet Institute's YouTube page. We've got a few we've got one Facebook page and one Facebook group. If you want to get into the conversation, we'd love to chat with you. But Joe, I love you, brother.
Love you too, man.
And we will see you guys next time.
See you later.